Well, shalom, shalom, Israel. I'm Rebekah Bat Yeshua from Yeshua Ministries, and welcome to the upper room. I wanted to feel like Miriam of Magdala, who followed Yeshua and who I imagine was there in the upper room with the disciples the evening that he had his Last Supper. I have no idea how the ladies of the biblical time wore these because these things get in the way so much. I've been struggling with it for a while, but it's cool. It's like, I love this thing. I made this for my daughter's bat mitzvah many years ago. I actually like to call it a bat brit instead of a bat mitzvah, brit being covenant. So I thought it would be appropriate to wear here as I am going to rehearse what happened the night before Passover in the upper room. I've been wanting to do it for a while now, but the opportunity hasn't given itself, but this time I made it happen. So this is our little upper room. I took our big table. We have a big log table that has a frame underneath, and the top is huge and it's thick, and so we unscrewed it and dropped it to the floor, put this on top of some milk crates, and I have a nice linen tablecloth here. I got some wooden plates, really nice thick, I don't know if you can see that, but really nice thick wooden plates, and some really beautiful bowls, wooden bowls. For this meal, I have a wooden plate here that was given to me by a friend, and I think I'm going to kind of expand my repertoire of my things for the upper room as time goes by. I have here a really nice cup that's holding the wine. I have some nice candles or oil lamps that we got when we were in Israel a few years ago. But I'm almost out of wick, so I'm going to need to figure out how to purchase some wick. I also have a tub in order to wash feet in, and a shofar to blow. This has a little incense in it to light, and then I have some bread that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Back here I have the menorah, obviously. I have a harp that was given to us by somebody. It was bought in Israel. So here we go. We're going to start looking at what happened the night before Passover. Okay? Taping this because I want to remember what I learned this year. I want my family to remember. In all of that, you're getting to benefit because I'm going to post this on YouTube, and you can benefit from what I've learned about what happened the night before Passover. To rehearse just for a little bit what the night was like, and what he talked about, what happened that evening, and so that we can learn and do likewise, because we are Yeshua's disciples, right? We want to be Talmudeans of his, want to follow him. And so I think as a believer in Messiah during the spring feast time, it is so appropriate to look at what happened the night before Passover and include that into our spring feast schedule. Okay, there is so much that happens here this night. It's pretty amazing, everything that happens, and it could take, you could spend hours and hours and hours teaching on this. I'm gonna just hit some highlights here, and you can do your own study and decide for yourself. So this is a source of division among many people, but also it's a source of confusion, I think. People don't quite understand. They think that the Last Supper, it's also known obviously as the Lord's Supper, they think that was actually the Passover meal, but it couldn't possibly have been the Passover meal. And I'm going to show you why I believe that. today, what I really wanted to do was divide between the Last Supper and Passover. So this is something that I wanted to do for a long time with my family, was to create an upper room where we looked at what Yeshua did the night before Passover. Growing up in Christianity, I believed that, like everyone else in Christianity, for the most part, believes that the Lord's Supper, or the Last Supper that he shared with his disciples, was actually the Passover meal, the Seder. And there are other ministries out there right now, other Melchizedek ministries, that teach that Yeshua actually changed Passover and somehow brought it to the right day on the 13th or something like that. And this is ridiculous and this is nonsense. You know, as if he reinterpreted it as far as changing his father's laws and instructions about how Passover is supposed to be celebrated, but he didn't. Out there in the upper room that night before Passover, he had his last meal with his disciples. It was a very, very important meal because he was actually doing something super important, and I want to go over that today. But first, I want to distinguish this between the Passover and make sure that you and I are on the same page as to why this cannot possibly be at all the Passover. And I hope you understand what I mean by that. So on the 14th day of the first month is the rehearsal of Passover. That's when we find Yehovah's Passover. And it was the night before Passover that he actually had his Last Supper with his disciples. Okay, so it wasn't actually on the 14th that he had his Last Supper, because the 14th was actually Passover, the day that he was crucified and murdered. And just so you know, I have two things here. Well, I have three things. I have my internet that I'm going to look at some Prezi slides that is actually in our Kingdom University vault. So if you go into teshuvaministries.com, you click on Learn, you see Kingdom University, click on Kingdom University, and you can see in there some courses that are available to you. Now in there, one of the course, it's not really a course, it's just an archive. It's called the Kingdom's University Vault. And in there, there's lots of articles and different things that you can get and look at that aren't available anywhere else. But there's also in there, there's a lot of feast articles. There's more coming. I have so much more to put on there. But in there, there's a Prezi presentation about, was the Lord's Supper the Passover meal? It is a comprehensive study that walks you through, kind of like a PowerPoint on steroids. It's going to walk you through the events that night. And I'm actually going to walk you through some of them right now during this little basics teaching here. But you can definitely go into there for just, it's so cheap to get in there. And so you can look at all that stuff and you can actually have access to those yourself. The other thing I have here is my Spring Feast handbook. And in here it covers Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, ascension, and Shavuot actually has its own handbook, but this is an excellent resource. It has a ton of teaching in it. It has a Melchizedek Haggadah for the Seder. It has a ton of information in here, as well as recipes and ideas and all that stuff. But I also have in here teachings and stuff that talk about why this meal, this Last Supper, was so important. The covenant confirming meal, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And then I also have the chronological gospels because it puts Yeshua's ministry in chronological order, so his life in chronological order, as I say all the time. I mean, I think I've been saying this forever now. In almost all my videos, I've been saying this. I have to stop to fix the head covering. Okay, super cool. I like these. They're just super cool, but I think they're, I don't know, a little impractical at the same time. But anyway, the chronological gospels is awesome. I say this all the time, so I've been saying it like a lot lately, because it helps with understanding where Yeshua was at what time of the year. And so when you look at the feast, where was he on Passover? Well, according to the scriptures, he was the Passover. So he was being murdered on the day of Passover when all the other lambs were being sacrificed, okay? So we actually can see where he was prior to Passover and where he was the night before by looking at the chronological Gospels. We're going to rightly divide between the Last Supper and Passover. And I think this is really important because otherwise, if we miss this, that he was actually the Pesach lamb on Passover, then we really miss the whole entire point of Passover completely. So I think it's super important to get a grip on what that meal was about, what it was for, and the fact that it was not Passover, okay? Okay, so I hope that you have a pen and paper to write some things down. First of all, we're going to go over six basic reasons that I believe that the Last Supper, or aka the Lord's Supper, is not and cannot possibly be Passover or Pesach the Seder. There is no way he was eating the Pesach that night. And so here's why. And we're going to unpack each one of these, but let me just list them down for you right now. Number one is translation errors. Okay, I'm going to point that out in a minute. Number two, Yeshua would never have changed Yehovah, his father's instructions for Passover. Number three, the kind of bread he actually serves at this meal in the upper room. Well, let's look at that in a minute. And then number four, there's a purchasing of a sword command in there that he gives, and you're like, what? So we're going to look at that. And then number five, he actually gets rid of the leaven in his house that night, which is interesting. We're going to look at that. And then number six, which is the biggest of all, is that he actually had to fulfill the feast. Okay, he couldn't be eating it, he had to fulfill it. All right, so he actually had to be the meal on the table. All right, so let's look at each one of these. Number one, there's a translation issue, and the translators were not feast literate, basically. They didn't really understand the feast, and so when they translated things and they didn't understand what feast they were talking about, they just kind of always just put Passover in. You can see that in many different places. And so one of the strongest arguments for the fact that it was not the Passover meal was the fact that the translators actually made a gross error in the scriptures when they translated it. And anybody who is feast literate knows very quickly that can possibly be. So let's look at that. Matthew 26:2, 1 and 2, it says, when Yeshua had finished all these things, he said to his disciples, you know that in 2 days it is Passover and the Son of Man will be betrayed and crucified. So we know that he was talking actually on the 12th day of the first month. So 2 days later would be the 14th day of the first month, which is Passover, according to his father's Torah. And then you have Luke 22:1 that says, now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, okay? And then you have Mark 14:1 that says, after 2 days was the Passover and the feast of matzah, okay? So it's kind of nailing the time. We're at the 12th day, so in 2 days it's going to be Passover, right? Okay, so I want you to turn to Matthew 26:17 in your own scriptures, and let's see what it says. Okay, I have actually right here the NIV, and I'm going to read to you exactly what the NIV says. Matthew. Oops, there we go. Yeah, look at that, my Bible's falling apart. I have a new one I've got to start using. All right, Matthew 26:17 in the NIV says, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yeshua and asked, it says Jesus, and asked, where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover? Okay, so as you can see, we have a feast illiterate translator here, because obviously for anyone who knows the feast, the first day of unleavened bread is what? The first day of unleavened bread is a high Shabbat, right? And the first day of unleavened bread is actually the day after Passover. So his disciples would never be asking him, hey, the day after Passover, where do you want us to prepare the Passover for you? It doesn't make any sense, okay? So for anyone who understands the feast, you would absolutely know that first day of unleavened bread is a high Shabbat, and Passover is always the day before. So they wouldn't be asking Yeshua, hey, on the unleavened bread on the first day of unleavened bread, which is high Shabbat, hey, where do you want us to celebrate the Passover? That was yesterday. Okay? Duh. Okay, now we're going to look at that same verse in the chronological Gospels as it is translated more properly. So Matthew 26:17 says, now at the beginning of the preparations for unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yeshua, saying to him, where will you that we prepare for you to eat the Passover? Okay, so clearly you can see there that somebody who's translating this now knows and is feast literate and understands where in this timeline they were. I'll give you a few more verses there to look at. When Mark 14:12 says, at the beginning of the preparations for unleavened bread, when they prepared to sacrifice the Passover, Yeshua's disciples said, where will you that we go to prepare that you may eat the Passover? Okay. And then Luke 22:7 says, as the time of unleavened bread approached and the Passover must be prepared, Yeshua sent Kepha and Yohanan, go and prepare the Passover that we may eat. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. So in John 13:1, we're going to actually look at the timing of this meal that he has with his disciples. So John 13:1 says, now before the feast of Passover, Yeshua knew that the hour was come that he should depart out of this world to the Father. He, having loved his own which were in the world, loved them to the very end. And after the Last Supper had ended, okay? So that Last Supper was not the Feast of Passover. It was before the Feast of Passover. They just were having their Last Supper together, though it was a very important meal, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The timing of this meal is stated here in John 13:1-2, but Yohanan details the things that took place after the meal was finished. John's narrative is cited here to show that the Last Supper, which is detailed in the following narrative, occurs clearly before Passover. So I'm also going to read a little bit out of here to help you understand a little bit better. This is actually my Spring Feasts handbook. And in here, there is so much good stuff. There's stuff about Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits and Ascension. Shavuot actually has its own handbook, but this covers the spring feasts of Yehovah. It's really cool. It has recipes and ideas, celebration ideas. It has actual Melchizedek-minded Pesach Seder in here, or a Haggadah for your Seder, I should say. So this is a really good book that you need in your library to just help you as you walk through the feasts with a Melchizedek perspective. So didn't the disciples go and prepare the Passover meal for Yeshua? They were on their way to do that. They were preparing, yes, but the Passover meal wasn't going to be until the next day. This was the meal prior to Passover. And if we ignore this fact, that meal was not the Passover meal, then we have missed really the point of this entire Moedim, entire Passover. We've totally missed the point of it completely, because he had to actually be the meal on the table. Okay, and he couldn't be the meal on the table if he's sitting there eating the meal himself, right? So this is where he fulfilled Passover. But I'm kind of running ahead of myself. So first of all, we're going to, let me read this and we're going to finish up why there's some translation issues. If we want to understand just about anything in the Hebrew Scriptures, if we want to understand what the Hebrew Messiah was teaching and fulfilling, we must understand the feasts. During his 70-week ministry, he celebrated each of his father's Moedim and interpreted each one of them. The translators of the scriptures were not Hebrews, nor were they feast keepers, and thus they did not know the Moedim intimately. Unfortunately, because of this, there are translation errors in our scriptures. Super important to take into account here. So we must be careful. That was from the chronology of the Revelation, Michael Rood. And then, for instance, in the NIV, Matthew 26:17, like I said before, it reads, "On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yeshua and asked, 'Where do you want us to make preparations for you?'" This text does not make any sense to someone who actually keeps the feast at their appointed time every year. This passage reveals how ignorant of the Moedim the translators actually were. They did not understand the feast and how they worked. For anyone who understands the feast, they would know that the first day of unleavened bread is a high Shabbat, as I said earlier. Passover is always the day before unleavened bread. The disciples who knew their feast and had kept them all their lives would never make preparations for the Passover meal after the Passover meal on the first high Shabbat of unleavened bread. So there you go. That is number one, the first reason why I believe that the meal that he had with his Talmudim in the upper room was not the Passover because of translation errors. Okay? All right, let's go on to number two. What was the second reason? Yeshua would never have changed his father's instructions for Passover. It's Yehovah's Passover, right? He says it's his Passover. So Yeshua, his son, would never change the instructions for Passover, right? So there are some ministries out there that are saying that Yeshua corrected the rabbinical calendar, or the calendar that they were on back then, by moving Passover and bringing it back a day. But there is no place in Yeshua's ministry where he ever confronts the religious leaders about calendar. He never ever challenges the religious leaders on calendar. And they were still operating in the Aviv Barley sighted moon at that time. So let's just read here for a minute. The fact is that the calendar was correct at the time of Yeshua. Had there been a problem with the calendar and when they were keeping the feast days in Shabbat, then Yeshua would have corrected them during his ministry. He was expecting to die as a Passover lamb at twilight on the 14th day of the first month, just like he had witnessed from heaven for 1,000+ years, and just like he had witnessed during his life on earth for 29+ years. That said and agreed upon, we must also remember that Yehovah Elohim does not change, and that heaven and earth have to be gone in order for anything to be removed from the Torah. So therefore, Yah's son, Yeshua, would never have set out to change the date and requirements of Passover. So he did not replace the bitter herbs and the lamb required of his father's Passover with bread and wine. Okay, he was doing something different. What he was doing was he was interpreting what the Melchizedek brought Abraham many years before. So Yeshua was the actual fulfillment of Passover. That's what's so important here to really get a grasp on. Okay. Let's go and continue on here. Number 3 was the kind of bread he actually broke that night. Okay, so one of the commands, one of the biggest commands for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which at twilight, if they were having the meal on Passover, Passover being the day, and then that night starting the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the biggest thing is you can't have bread with yeast in it. So let's look at the kind of bread he actually breaks that night. Okay, so we have to actually look at 1 Corinthians 11:23. In 1 Corinthians 11:23, let's read it because it actually gives a clue into here as to what kind of bread Yeshua actually broke that night. For I received from Yehovah what I also passed on to you. The Lord Yeshua, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup in the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it. Remember me." Okay, so we're going to look at the word bread here. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread. Okay, so this is really important. So in the original, we see that word is actually 740, which means it's artos, which actually means a loaf. So that word bread is actually a loaf, which implies that there is leaven in it. So if it had been actual Pesach, if it had been the Seder meal, the Passover meal, then it wouldn't have used the word loaf. It would have used the word matzah, as in flat bread, as in bread with no yeast, as in unleavened bread. But this actually says that he broke leavened bread, probably more like challah, like they do every single, Friday evening as Shabbat comes. So to me, that's super powerful right there, because on the table, he would not have had leavened bread if it was the Passover meal. So this is part of the loaf that we made for our meal here in the upper room the other night right before Passover, right? Okay. All right, so the fourth reason why I believe that this was not the Passover meal is that Yeshua actually tells them to go sell something and go buy a sword that night. And if it had been Passover, if that had been this Passover meal, and that day had been Passover, and they were eating the meal at twilight, entering into the Feast of Unleavened Bread the first day, if you are feast literate, then you know that is a high Shabbat. There would have been no stores open at all. Plus, you're not supposed to be doing that on Shabbat. So he would never have commanded his disciples to go sell something and go buy something that night if it was actually the high Shabbat of unleavened bread. Okay, let's actually look at Luke 22:36. Okay, so and then he said here in Luke 22:36, now whoever does not have a sword, let him take his purse or his bag of provisions, or even sell a garment and buy one, because I'm telling you that which is written, he was reckoned among the transgressors, and this must still be accomplished by me. There is a reason for everything that is written concerning me. And they said, Master, look, we have 2 swords. And he said, that's enough. So kind of funny that, they have the swords, and what's a sword for? And then ends up one of them uses it later. I think it's Kepha uses it later, and then he gets rebuked for using it. I don't know. But anyway, point being is that it couldn't have been the Passover meal, because Yeshua said to go buy a sword, and he never would have done that because it was a high Shabbat. It would have been a high Shabbat. Okay, and then we have the fifth reason why I believe this was not the Passover meal, and that is the fact that Yeshua actually cleanses his house of leaven that night. And you're supposed to be doing that before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? So he actually gets rid of Judas that night. And so if that had actually been the Passover meal, it would have been too late by then, as far as I understand. And so we see clearly here that in John 13:26, he cleanses his house of leaven. So John 13:26 says, Yeshua answered, it is to whom I will give a sop when I have dipped it. When Yeshua dipped the sop, he gave it to Yehudis from Askereth, I don't know how to say that, the son of Shimon. And after the sop, Hasatan entered into Judas. Then Yeshua said to him, that which you do quickly. Okay, so then he leaves. After having received the sop, he went out immediately in verse 30, and it was night. The day of the preparation of Passover sacrifice had now officially begun. All right, so let's go on. Number 6, the sixth reason why this can't possibly be the Passover meal was that he had to fulfill Pesach. He had to actually be the lamb on the table. To me, this is like the most important one. Really, this is the clincher of them all, is that for thousands of years, Israel had been rehearsing this feast ever since they were Hebrews that were delivered out of Egypt. They had a lamb on the table, and that lamb represented the lamb to come. The blood from that lamb on the doorpost represented, it was symbolic of the lamb's better blood that would be on the doorpost of our hearts in the future. And he had to actually be that lamb, to fulfill it to the day and to the hour. So the feasts are like, well, they're shadow pictures of good things to come, of course, but they are rehearsals of things that are going to happen in the future. So I think one of the coolest things about the Feast of Yehovah is that they're so detailed. There's so much in there, and you look at the instructions that Yehovah gave for them. You look at how the temple services went, and then you can look forward and you can go, whoa, how did Yeshua fulfill all those? And if he didn't fulfill them to the day, to the hour, exactly like it was being done and had been set up by Yehovah, then he wouldn't have been the actual lamb. We could tell he wasn't the actual lamb, right? But because he fulfilled everything to the day, to the hour, then we know he was the actual Lamb of Yehovah. So this is super important. So looking at the idea that Passover is the 14th day of the month, that they were on the right calendar, the right reckoning at that time. So they were actually, I have a seventh reason. I'm going to write my seventh reason down. Hold on. Yay, thank you, Ra Kakodesh. Okay, so if you look at it, if you look at the covenant that was made between Abraham and Yehovah back in Genesis 15, you see the animals were cut in half and split there, and you see the birds' bones weren't broken. It was a shadow picture of what Yeshua, who went through those pieces, it was a shadow picture of what Yeshua, who went through those pieces on Abraham's behalf, was going to look like when he was sacrificed in the future. So his bones would not be broken, but he was going to look gnarly, right? And he did. It was a gnarly, very, very gnarly murder. And but he was the lamb. He went into the tomb at the very same hour that the high priest put his lamb into the oven. And the fact that it was a work day, that Passover was a work day, that was when he did his work that day, was to be the suffering servant, the Lamb of Yehovah. Everything was so precise. And I love that, because you can look at how the feast was actually celebrated and what traditions there were, what temple services there were, and then look and say, did he fulfill those? Was he actually to the day of the hour? Yes, he was. And so if you try to move Passover to that night, how can that be? It doesn't work. He's not on the table as the lamb, right? He's eating it. That doesn't work. So no, that was not the Passover. But here I just received, how cool is this? Another seventh reason, which I love the number 7 instead of 6, right? But there's 7 reasons. There's one more reason why he couldn't possibly have been eating the Passover meal that night when he was with his disciples. But if that was a Passover meal, then that means that he would have actually died on a Shabbat. He would have actually died on the first high Shabbat of unleavened bread, which that is not restful. Everything he went through that day was a work day. It was a work day for him. It wasn't actually a rest day. The moment that he died, he got rest. He was finally free of the suffering. He got momentary relief in that he fell asleep, and he got the rest, right? And that happened on Shabbat. If you look at the idea that the Pharisees didn't want anything to do with touching him and being the ones to do that, otherwise they would have been defiled for the feast that was right coming up. And so they made the Romans do it, they made everybody else do it, but they didn't want to touch him, right? And so they didn't want that to interfere with them entering to the feast. So we know what day he actually died. It was on Passover, not on the high Shabbat. That would not have been, why would his father have him sacrificed on a Shabbat? Okay. All right, so that was just a couple things there, 7 reasons as to why I believe that the Last Supper was not the Pesach meal. Now, we have that cleared up, so let's move on as to find out what this meal was actually about then. So if it wasn't the Passover, what actually was it? Because it was something that was super important. So Yeshua Ministries actually has a comprehensive study on the timeline from the Last Supper clear through his death that nails, with comprehensive look at the scriptures, the timeline, and nails out the details of what happened throughout that 24-hour period. So if you want to go see that, then go to teshuvaministries.com, and up in the navigation bar you will see a tab called Learn. Click on that, and then it drops down and you'll see Kingdom University. Click on that and then go to Kingdom University. You'll see the courses there that Kingdom University has available. One of those is called the Vault, Kingdom University Vault. Now, it's not really a course per se. You just basically purchase a key to get in there to the vault, and then you can have access to a ton of different content, articles, and different things that aren't available anywhere else. Well, in there, there's a section called, I think it's articles on the feasts and things like that, and you will see this presentation. It's called Yeshua Fulfilled Passover, Pesach. Yeshua fulfills Pesach. I have it pulled up right here so I can see, but I'm not going to walk you through that right now because it is super long and it will take you some time to go through. It just really nails out how Passover was fulfilled that year, as well as it looks at the original Passover and the timeline of that and how it works together. So the Passover that he was celebrating actually goes it stays in step with the Passover that Yehovah gave Israel to do as Yehovah walked Israel out of Egypt. So it's the same timeline, super cool. But we're going to go ahead and go forward now, and we're going to just assume that you're on the same page with me, and that now we have established that that Last Supper was not and could not be the Passover meal. All right, I'm off onto something else. Let's figure out, actually, since it wasn't that, what was that meal? What was that meal about? Because actually it is a very important meal. So let's talk about that for a little bit. We've established that the Last Supper was not the Passover meal. So since it wasn't that, what actually was it? Because there was something super important going on there, wasn't there? All right, I'll tell you what it was. Listen up, Israel. It was the covenant confirming meal of the new contract. Okay. It was a covenant confirming meal of the new covenant, as most people know, but I call it contracts, okay? So I actually call the, when Israel was at the base of Mount Sinai and they entered into contract there to keep the royal law that was in the Ark of the Covenant, in the Ark of the Covenant, that was the first contract, okay? They broke that contract. It had a fault in it. The fault was it didn't have the Ruach HaKodesh that came with that contract. The second contract is what he is providing us with this meal. Actually, this is the covenant confirming meal of that second contract to keeping the royal law of love that is in the Ark of the Covenant, that is everlasting, always been and always will be. So this is super good news. So let's just chat about that for a bit. So you see at base of Mount Sinai, you have a full-on covenant. It's a blood-ratified covenant, right? So there's stipulations, there's laws to follow, and Yahweh says to his bride to be, will you obey? And she says yes. And then Moses wrote everything down. He made a sacrifice and sprinkled the blood of that sacrifice on the people and on the book of the covenant. And then they had a covenant confirming meal on the floor of heaven. Yes, so they had it's kind of like a wedding ceremony, a wedding that you go to. You have the two parties. You have the groom and you have the bride, and you have the family of both there. And so then, you have this covenant confirming meal together that says, you have the agreement basically that says, will you? Yes, I will, this sort of thing. And then you have this covenant confirming meal actually. And, both parties coming together, both families coming together to, take part in something and eat something together, symbolizing that they are willing and happy that this is the situation that they find themselves in, that they're going to become one big family now. And that this agreement stays, right? And then with marriage, you have it's basically a blood ratified covenant as well after they consummate it, okay? So, you look forward into this new, because this is what Israel did back then. You had the whole covenant confirming meal, you had the blood ratification, you had the agreement. Okay, that was all backwards, but anyway, you know what I mean. So, and then you get to Yeshua, and he's basically showing us how to enter into this contract. Super amazing. So he's basically, got the bread and the wine for us to eat of, so that we say, yes, we want to be in this contract. We make this agreement. We want to be in this contract. The next day, when he actually became the lamb and his blood was shed, that would be the blood ratification that we needed, right? And it went down and it anointed the Ark of the Covenant on the west side. That is the blood ratification that we need, being able to smear his blood on the doorposts of our heart, to get clean and cleansed with his blood. That's all blood ratification to this new covenant. So what he was doing that night was actually performing the covenant confirming meal of this new and better, superior contract that he was giving Israel, so that they could actually keep the royal law of love that was in the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so they could actually keep the covenant that was in the Ark of the Covenant. You got it? And I think it's super interesting that he was interpreting the Melchizedek's bread and wine. Remember the Melchizedek that came, the Melchizedek priest that came to Abraham back in Genesis, you see, and we believe that was Shem, actually, because Shem and Noah and Abraham were all contemporaries. And so we believe that was Shem, but that Melchizedek priest showed Abraham the bread and the wine tradition and told him what that was for, what it prophesied about, what it was symbolic of. And so what's interesting to me is that Yeshua, as the new high priest, the new Kohen Gadol in the new order of Melchizedek, is actually interpreting what the Melchizedek showed Abraham back a long time ago. He's interpreting that right there with his new disciples, as he's actually becoming the bread and the wine, and he's interpreting it at that meal. I just think that is amazing. The Melchizedek taught Abram the rehearsal of bread and wine. Abram taught Isaac, then Isaac taught it to Jacob, then Jacob taught it to his 12 sons, who were going to become the royal priesthood of the first contract. Unfortunately, that didn't happen as planned, so at the end of the imposed and temporary Levitical priesthood, it is interesting that Yeshua took the helm. As Yeshua took the helm, he interpreted the bread and wine again as a Melchizedek rehearsal, literally as he was becoming the bread and the wine. This ancient rehearsal had been performed for thousands of years. He was saying that the bread had always represented his body that would be broken for Israel, and the wine had always represented his blood that would be shed for Israel. In John 8:56, it says, "Your father Abraham was overjoyed to see my day. He saw it and was glad." On page 223 of the Chronological Gospels, the commentary actually reads, Abraham had indeed seen Yeshua's day in the representation of the shed blood and the broken body that the Melchizedek shared with him. Abraham rejoiced and laid a tenth of his vast wealth at the feet of the priest for the Most High Elohim. Okay, so let's read what he did that night. Let's just look here at, again, we're going to look at Matthew 26:26. So Yeshua actually takes the bread and he blesses the Most High. Let's look and see what he says. As they were eating, Yeshua took the bread, blessed the Most High, and then broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then he takes the cup and he gave thanks again and gave it to them, saying, "Drink all of it, for this is the renewed covenant," or actually it says new covenant, "in my blood, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, from this day forward, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the new day when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom." And then we look at Mark 14:22. And it says again, as they ate, Yeshua took bread and blessed YHVH ELOHIM, right? Yes, this is just Mark's take on it. Broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. He said to them, "This represents my blood shed for the new covenant, which is done for many." All right, and then let's look at Luke 22:17. Yeshua takes the cup, gave thanks, and said, "Take this cup and divide it among yourself, for I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of Yahweh shall come." He took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Likewise, also the cup after supper, saying, "This cup represents the new covenant in my shed blood." Okay, so through this work that he's done, through the fact that he is the bread, through the fact that he is the wine, he is the blood that we get to consume, now he can actually bring the new covenant, the new contract. And now we have the ability to grow in holiness and to eventually keep it perfectly like he did. Okay, so just going back here into Jeremiah 31:31, or yeah, 31:30, 31:30. Yeah, 31:30. Let's just look at where this new covenant is prophesied, okay? It's right here. It says, "The time is coming, declares Yehovah, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them." That's super important to get a grip on and really learn well. Let's look at Ezekiel 36:26-27. All right, this says, "For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers. You will be my people, and I will be your Elohim. I will save you from all your uncleanliness." All right, there it is spoken of again in there. And actually it is referred to in Deuteronomy as well, prophesied that that would happen. And so Yeshua's actually come to fulfill that and to actually give us the new contract, the new covenant. And if you notice there, it says that he's going to write his law on our hearts, right? So another thing I think is a really cool point is when Moses, the first time, goes up to the mountain and he brings down the tablets of stone that have the covenant written on it. And remember, he sees the camp in idolatry, and he knows that they have just broken the covenant that Yehovah just wrote on stone. So he takes the covenant and he throws it down, breaking it, symbolic of the fact that they just broke it. Okay, but then what does Yehovah tell him to do? He tells him to, you go get some stones and you bring them up here to me, and then I will write my law on it. That is so prophetic, because he's basically saying in the future, then you are going to bring your heart to me, and then I'm going to give you a new one. I'm going to write on it my covenant, my laws, and my statutes, and my decrees. And those are the words that he spoke from the mountain from Exodus 19 through 24. You see his words, his actual words that he spoke out to Israel. And Yeshua spoke those same words, because Yeshua didn't come to speak his own words, he came to speak his Father's words. All right, let's go on. Okay, so when my family and I had our little upper room meal here in the upper room in our home, we broke bread and we drank the cup. We also washed each other's feet. And then we read the words of Yeshua. Like, what did he speak on that night? What did he think was so important for his disciples to know before he went to the cross or to the stake? So he's our rabbi. We're supposed to pay attention to what he says, and we're supposed to do what he says. He's the prophet. We are supposed to shema, right? So as his disciple, it is super important to know what a rabbi spoke on, right? And he's going to highlight what he thinks is probably most important for his disciples to know right before he dies, so that is really etched into their mind. Like, wow, what did he speak on right before he died? They're going to look back on that and really recall what he said. At least that's the goal, right? So let's look and see what he actually said that night. So I have found 8 things that he spoke on while they were sitting around the table that night. And then he spoke on some more things when they're actually walking to the Garden of Gethsemane. And then he actually has some things in his prayer. So he prays for his disciples right before he is betrayed. And there's some beautiful things in there. And so I want to just go over those really quickly with you, because I think they are so important to remember as we go into Pesach, as we go into the feast, and as we live our life as a disciple of his. What was his focus? What did he want us to focus on? So let's look at what he actually spoke on, okay? Okay, do you have a piece of paper and a pen handy? So let's go ahead and write down the 8 things that he talked about around the supper table that night. Number 1, he talked about new and quality love. So he actually talked about the new commandment he gave. We're going to talk about that in a second, because that is really super important to understand what he's saying there. Number 2, you have to serve in order to be great. So if you want to be great in the kingdom, then you're going to be a servant to others. Number 3, he talked about being in Yehovah, and Yehovah in him, and then him in us, and us in him. So in this echad state is what he wants his disciples to live in. So in an echad state. Number 4, he talked about, if you love me, then keep my commandments. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Number 5, he talked about his disciples asking anything in his name, and then the Father would do it. And then number 6, he talked about not letting your heart be troubled and having real shalom, and what that means. Number 7, he talked about them needing to remember that he was going to come back for them. So he was going to go away, and then he was going to come back for them. And he told them to remember that. And then finally, number 8, around the supper table, he talks about the fact that they all know the way to get to where he's going. Okay, so let's look at each one of these just for a moment. Number 1, the new and quality love. Here, let me write something down here. Okay, so number 1, let's look at John 13:34-35. I am also giving you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. love another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Okay, so I want to just look at this for a second, because he's not actually establishing a brand new commandment, people. And this is where Christians really go off on this, that he brought a new commandment and that's all we have to obey is his new commandment. But we're going to find out that Yeshua actually did not bring his own words, but his Father's words. And the idea to love is not a new thing, okay? The author of love, the love itself, which is YHVH ELOHIM, the family in heaven, this is an old commandment in the sense of we were supposed to love each other like them from the beginning. As image bearers, that is part of our job, is to operate like they do, and they operate in other-centered love. That's what other-centeredness, I mean, that's what love is other-centeredness. The true love is other-centeredness. And so we as image bearers are supposed to be other-centered. We've always supposed to have been that way. So we've always been supposed to love. But here you actually see that word in the original, and check it out. That original word is the word kanos. It's number 2537 in the Strong's. But it's kanos, and it means actually new in quality, not found exactly like this before is what it means. So isn't that awesome? Is that it means new in quality. So he's going to actually bring us the ability to have a new in quality type love, one that's going to set us apart from the people keeping the old contract, because the old contract didn't come with the perks that the new contract comes with. The new contract is superior to the old one because it actually has the Ruach HaKodesh with it, whereas the old one had a fault in it, and the fault was it didn't have the Ruach HaKodesh with it, right? So both contracts are supposed to be keeping the same royal law of love, but this one had a fault in it. The old one, it didn't have the Ruach HaKodesh in it. The new one has the Ruach HaKodesh, which means that with a new heart, with the Ruach HaKodesh, help with eating of Yeshua, with all the provision that he's made for keeping this new contract, you're totally capable of keeping the royal law of love that is actually in the Ark of the Covenant. Isn't that awesome? But one of the things is he says you have this new in quality love. So I think it's super interesting because the Ark of the Covenant houses the covenant, and in there is basically the royal law of love, right? It is it's everlasting. It always was and it always will be. It's written down for us on these tablets of stone that are in the Ark of the Covenant. But it is the royal law of love. It's actually Yehovah's character written out in human words so that we can kind of understand. And it's how he wants us to love him. It's how he wants us to love others. And so Yeshua is really establishing again the royal law of love only. Now, the royal law of love has always been. So even when you had the Levitical law, the Levitical law was extra law. So it was under the royal law. So you had both of them to keep, right? So Yeshua's sacrifice on the cross got rid of and nailed to the cross the Levitical law. And if you don't know this, watch my Pesach teaching. That will help, as well as my Shavuot Basics 2 teaching. You can also find some more content there on that. But basically, I find it super interesting that he's talking in the moment when the change is happening, the change from Levitical to Melchizedek. In that moment that it's happening, he focuses on the fact that he's going to give us a new and quality kind of love, right? Because the whole point is that if we don't love, then we're breaking the commandments. If we're not other-centered, then we become selfish. We become, we want to save ourselves, that sort of thing. We're going to actually preserve ourselves instead of loving the other to the point of giving our life for the other. And so he's like, no, as this priesthood is changing, I'm going to make it very, very clear what kind of love you are going to have, and I'm going to give you a new in quality type love. Which is never seen, hasn't been seen before here on earth. So it's going to be more the kind of love that Yehovah has, the kind of love that Yeshua has. So he's saying, do what I do, love like I love, and then you'll be golden. Love like I love. There's no greater love than he who lays down his life for a friend. That's Yeshua. Yeshua laid his life down for us. And so as Talmudim of his, as disciples of his, then we're going to do what our rabbi does, right? Which is have that new and quality love that will go to the lengths of being so other-centered that you're going to lay your life down for the other person. That right there is so beautiful and such a key to this whole thing of what the royal law of love is and what Yeshua is doing here. And I love it because as we're moving into unleavened bread, unleavened bread is all about eating of Yeshua and becoming just like him, by eating of him, by following him, by contemplating him, by watching him, by doing things the way he does, and by loving the way he does. And I find it so beautiful that at the moment of this change happening, that he is saying, you're going to love in a brand new way. All right, so I'm just so sorry about that. I just realized that I didn't have my mic actually plugged into the phone. So hopefully the rest of this will be easier to hear. I don't want to redo that, but you get my point with the whole new and quality love. And actually, I have a study in the Kingdom University Vault that talks about new and quality love and the new wineskins that Yeshua talks about. So that also has to do with the change in priesthoods from Levitical to Melchizedek. So you might want to go grab that as well. So before we go on to number 2, I just want to mention that as he's talking about this new and quality love, not only does he speak it, but he actually does it. He actually shows them what he's talking about, which I don't understand why they didn't catch that. I mean, the whole entire year they're following him. All he is other-centered. All he is pouring himself out. So I don't know why he had to go another step, but obviously they needed another word picture. And so he washes their feet, right? So he gets a pail, he girds his loins, I guess, and he puts a towel around him, and he actually gets down and does something that servants did back then, which is wash the dirt off of each other's, or the master's feet. And so he gets down and does that for his disciples. And maybe that was just maybe that word picture was really strong because they were used to seeing servants or slaves wash the feet of the masters. Whether they had servants that did that or not, I don't know. Or if they came from that kind of status, I don't know. But I think that he drove in the idea that I want you to serve others. I want you to have this other-centered love that is just like my Father and I have, so much so that we would give our life for the other person. So I love that. I love that because that's really what the royal law is all about. And he's taking away the heavy law, and he's bringing his light law, which is the Melchizedek law. Okay, enough of that. Let's go on to number 2. Okay, another thing that he talked about that night was to serve. In order to be great in the kingdom, you must serve others. This goes again into this whole idea of loving. How do you love others? Okay, so here in Luke 22:26, you see that right before they're having a little argument, the disciples are, about who's going to be greatest in the kingdom. And Yeshua said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise that authority are bestowed with titles of nobility. But it shall not be so among you. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he that desires to be exalted, let him become as a servant. Isn't that amazing? Tell me, who is considered greater, he who reclines at dinner or he who serves? Is it not he who reclines? But I have been among you as one who serves. You are the few who have remained with me through all my trials, and for that faithfulness I will award a kingdom to you, just as my Father has awarded a kingdom to me. One day you will eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So we can see here that in order to be great in the kingdom, you must serve. All right, serve others. All right, on to number 3. And then the third thing that I see that he's talking to his disciples about as they're sitting around the supper table is he's talking about him being in the Father being in him, and him being in them, and them being in him, and the rock being in them. So there's all this echadness, like inside each other sort of thing. So you're going to absorb and consume and become like idea. So let's look at John 14, 10 to 11. 16 through 20, and then 26. So let's look here at John 14, where he says all this. It's pretty cool. He says, how can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words that I speak to you are not of myself, but the Father that dwells in me. He does the miraculous works. Either believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me, or believe the miracles. And then he says in verse 16, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another comforter who will abide with you forever, the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it can neither see her or know her. But you will know her because she will dwell with you and shall be in you. No, I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you. And then later in verse 20, he says, in that day you will know that I am in my Father, and that you are in me, and that I am in you. Let's see. Oh, there's one more here. 26. Then it goes on in verse 26, but the Comforter, which is the gift of the Ruach HaKodesh, which the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will bring all things that I have spoken to you back to your remembrance. So he's big on the idea of get me in you. You in me, I in you, blah, blah, blah. This is super cool. And he repeats this on their walk to the Garden of Gethsemane. I think it's super amazing that he's talking about this right before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread, he's going to be in the grave. He won't be able to interpret that feast. So he's doing it right here. He's saying, I want you to eat of me. How do you get something into you unless you eat of it, right? You watch a movie, you get the movie into you. You watch a book, you read a book, you get the book into you. There's all different ways of eating. And so the Feast of Unleavened Bread is all about eating. You eat unleavened bread. You eat of the unleavened one, right? And that's how you get them in you, Yehovah and Yeshua in you. It's how you get the Ruach HaKodesh in you, right? You must eat. Let's go on here. Number 4, we see Yeshua talking around the table about obeying his commandment, okay? So I think that one of the things that is can be super confusing to our Christian friends, and actually to us as we try to explain, is that he says here that he wants you to keep my commandments. So I think people think, well, he's trumping Yehovah's commandments by saying my commandments. So instead of directly saying right here, keep Yah's commandments, he says keep my commandments, okay? So we have to just look at this for a second and go, whoa, wait a minute. What did Yeshua say? He said that his words were not his words, that his words were from the Father. Okay, so he didn't speak his own words, he was speaking the Father's words, which were the same words that were spoken at the mountain. So we have to know that he wasn't saying, ignore Yehovah's commandments and only keep mine. That's not what he's saying, because he doesn't have any of his own. He was simply repeating Yehovah's commandments. So when he said, I have a new commandment that I give you, love one another, that's not in the sense that sort of, it's not a brand new thing. I mean, that was established a very long time ago, as we talked about before. What he's saying is a new in quality. So a revelation that my husband got as we were talking about this right before I started filming was that perhaps he was distinguishing himself from the other rabbis. So obviously back then there were a ton of rabbis, there was a ton of teachers, and disciples or people would basically find one that they liked, that they wanted to learn from, and then they would copy everything they do and learn from that rabbi. So could he have been distinguishing himself from the other rabbis by saying, you know, you're not going to follow that rabbi or that teacher, you're going to obey me. And what I'm going to tell you is obey Yehovah, because those were the words that are coming out of my mouth, is his words. So I like that. I think that clarifies for me a lot of that, to say, he's going to say, you're my Talmudim, you're my disciples. If you love me, then you're going to keep my commandments. And what is my commandment? My commandment is that you obey Yehovah. I'm going to point you towards Yehovah because the words that I speak are not my own. So the new commandment I give is, you know, his new commandment is a new equality type love. That's always been. It was always a command. It wasn't even a command. It was the way we were supposed to just be, right? And then it had to be commanded. But now with the work of Yeshua, we have the ability to have it become natural, to actually be restored in this area, to be able to be to be able to operate in an other-centered love like they do, like Yehovah and Yeshua and the Rock do. How cool is that? I mean, that's restoration, partial restoration, absolutely. Okay, so some verses you can look up there. Here I'm just going to tell you John 14:15, John 14:21, and 23 to 24. You also see John 12:49 and John 17:6, John 15:10, 12, and 15. Let's look at John 12:49 real quick together. Okay, so in John 12:49, let's just back up. It says in 47, if any man hears my words and believes not, I do not judge him, because I have not come to judge the world, but have come to save it. He that rejects me and receives not my words already has one that judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. I have not spoken these words of myself, but the Father which sent me commanded me concerning what I should say and what I should speak. I know that his commandments bring life everlasting. Therefore, I speak and have spoken everything the Father commanded me. Okay, so that is awesome. That went all the way through 50. So John 12:49 through 50 teaches us what Yeshua, which commandments he wanted us to follow. And it was his Father's, because he didn't speak his own words, right? He didn't have his own Torah. He spoke the Torah of his Father. Okay, and then the fifth thing that I see that our Rabbi Yeshua spoke of around the supper table that night was that he connected the idea with asking for something, connected directly to keeping the commandments. So if you don't keep the commandments, you can't ask for something, vice versa. So the idea that they're connected. So let's look at that. John 14:13 to 14. John 14:13 to 14 says, whatever you ask the Father in my name, that I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you shall ask anything in my name, I will do it. If you love me, keep the commandments. Okay, so he's saying, if you ask anything in my name, I will do it. And he doesn't even pause. There's no comma. It's just like he doesn't even pause. It just says, if you love me, keep my commandments. So it's connected with asking. Okay, and then number 6, the sixth thing that I see him talking about around the supper table that night is he starts off his conversation around the table by saying, do not let your heart be troubled. And then he ends it by saying, again, basically, don't let your heart be troubled. So here we see in John 14:1, it says, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in Yehovah, believe also in me. And then John 14:27, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you, not as a peace that the world gives, but I give you real peace. Do not let your hearts be troubled, neither let it be afraid. That's verse 27. So you see him talking about peace that he gives, not the peace like the world gives, but peace like he gives. And you see him say, don't let your heart be troubled. all right, now I'm going to tell you some stuff. And then at the very end, don't let your heart be troubled. Okay. And then that's really important because of what's going to happen. You know, what's right around the corner for these disciples is huge. And he wanted to like drill that in. Don't let your heart be troubled. So then the seventh thing that I see him talk about around the supper table kind of goes along the same idea. He starts and he ends with the same sort of idea, same sort of teaching. And one at the beginning, he says, don't let your hearts be troubled because I am going to go and then I'm going to come back and get you. And then at the end, he says the same thing. Do not let your heart be troubled because I'm going to go away, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to get you. So let's look at those verses. John 14:2 and 3 says, in my Father's house are many apartments. If it were not so, wouldn't I have told you? I'm going to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. So he's saying, I'm going to come back and I'm going to get you and I'm going to take you with me. And then in verse 28, you've heard how I have said to you, I am going away, but will come again to you. If you really love me, you would rejoice because I said I'm going to the Father, because my Father is greater than I. So here he says again, I'm going to come again to you. Yeah, that's good news. That's good news. All right, and then the last thing that I see him teaching at the supper table that night is the fact that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that we actually know the way to, that his disciples know the way to where he is going and how to get there. So let's look at that. John 14:4-6. John 14:4-6. Says, you know where I am going and you know the way. And then later on it says, Yeshua said to Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. All right, that's really awesome. So he is the way and the truth and the life. So he's rehearsing these things at the Last Supper, kind of like highlighting them, because I believe he's already talked about them before in his ministry, but he's highlighting them, saying, it's super important that you remember these things because I'm going to go away and you need to have these solid in your hearts. Okay, so we're going to look into, just for a few minutes, into the rest of the evening. So after they ate and after Yeshua washed their feet, then they sang some songs. Psalms. They sang some psalms. All right, and then they began to walk to the Mount of Olives. Okay, so on the walk to the Mount of Olives, he prophesies that they all are going to be offended of him and they are all going to leave. That must have totally broken his heart. I mean, that in itself would be a hard pill to swallow, knowing that you want them to have this new and quality love. You're hoping that they, have it, but then realizing that they are just minutes after you give this command, they're going to basically not follow through on that. But he also recognizes, as you'll see in a little bit, that he knows he has to go so that the Ruach HaKodesh can come and actually make that change in the heart and give them the new heart that's going to give them that new and quality love. So they actually didn't have that new and quality love at that moment, even though, which blows my mind, even though they had been walking with him and following him that whole time, that whole year. They still, they were so close to him. They got to see him and touch him and hug him and hear his voice and see his face and his reactions and his personality. They were taking in and eating so much of him, and yet they still didn't have that new and quality love. Had they had that new and quality love, I really think that we would have seen a different picture there that night, that they wouldn't have been offended of him. They would have laid their life down for him. They would have, been, they wouldn't have left him that night at his darkest hour. So, that blows me away. But it also is telling that the new covenant still hadn't come yet. I mean, he was doing the covenant confirming meal that night, but the blood still had to be it still had to be ratified in his blood. That hadn't happened yet. And he had to leave in order for the Ruach HaKodesh to come and do all the work that she does on our hearts, to give us that new heart that has his law written on it, that has that new and quality love. So I think that it's real telling as to why they were offended and why they left. So it helps me understand that a little bit better. All right, so we see in John, let me see here, John 15, 16, and 17, the rest of that evening and before basically the early morning hours, and before he's betrayed, we see what takes place. So they're walking to the Kidron Valley, they're walking to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he teaches them on the way. And I think it's really important to look at what he's talking about here, because again, these are his last words right before he is betrayed and before he dies. So we want to really pay close attention to what he's saying right here. So let's look again at this list. I know this is long. I thought it would be quick, but you know, that's okay. You can pause this video, take a break, watch the rest of it next week, however it works for you. But for me, I'm getting it all out today. So a lot of these things in here, he actually is repeating from his ministry. He's repeating it from supper, actually. So he's trying to drill home a few things. Let's look and see what he's trying to drill home. So in order to cut down a little bit on time, I'm just going to tell you this is in John 15, 16, and 17 as to what he talks about as they're walking to the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm just going to line out what it is he talks about. So he actually, let me see here, 14... He talks, I see 17 specific things that he mentions. The first one is being the vine. He's the vine and we are the branches, and that we can't do anything without him, and that we need to stay connected to him. We need to stay attached. The word is attached. We need to stay attached to him. And the idea that we will get pruned so that we actually bear good fruit. And that through that pruning, we will actually bear a lot of fruit. And he says, if you bear a lot of fruit, then you will actually be known as my disciples. My disciples will be bearing a lot of fruit. And that through that bearing much fruit, you will glorify YHVH ELOHIM. The second thing I see that he's talking about as they're walking is he's talking about ask. Ask in my name, ask my Father in my name, and it will be done. He mentions in there that you can ask for the Ruach HaKodesh. He mentions in there, ask for joy, and it will be overflowing idea. He talks about this 4 times on their way to the garden. So he says, ask 4 times and it will be given to you. And he tells you what you can ask for. And at other places he doesn't, but we can pretty much know what he's telling us to ask for. We're supposed to ask for the Ruach HaKodesh. But he says you can ask for joy. And that would come with the Ruach, right? And then twice on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, I want you to love like I love. Go all the way to laying your life down for a friend. And again, that just reiterates and puts the exclamation point on what he's talking about with this new and quality love. Okay, and then the fourth thing that I see that they were talking about, or he was talking about to his disciples, teaching them on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, was that he said, keep my commandments. And he said, if you're my friend, you will keep the commandments. So that was number 4. And striking in there again that he's not saying it's brand new commandments, he's saying keep my commandments as I am your rabbi, keep my commandments, and I'm telling you to keep YHVH's commandments. We can see that in John 17:6 through 8 and 14. It says, I have declared your name to the men you gave me out of the world. Yours they were, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything you have given me is from you. I have given to them the words which you gave to me, and they have received them. And then verse 14 says, I have given them your word. All right, so here's Yeshua saying again, it's not my words, it's your words, Yehovah, that I've been giving to them. So we can see when he says, keep my commandments, he's saying, like I believe, like my husband, his epiphany just a little bit ago, was that he's saying he's distinguishing himself from the other rabbi, saying, I'm your rabbi, keep my words, keep my commandments, which my commandments are directly associated with the Father's commandments. So they don't go against him, they're not new. They're his, they're Papa's. The fifth thing I see him talking about is about his disciples bearing fruit. And actually he says fruit that remains. That's very interesting. So we got to bear fruit, but also fruit that remains. And then the sixth thing I see him talking about is he talks about having his joy to capacity. So he wants them to have his joy to capacity. And then the seventh thing is that he has chosen them. So he talks about him choosing them. And the eighth thing I see is he talks about how the world hates them because they are his. Number 9, he talks about how he and his work revealed sin, and because he reveals the sin, the world hates him. And then, of course, the world is going to hate his disciples because they also are going to do the same thing that he's doing, which is revealing sin, right? Okay, and then the 10th thing that I see him talking about as they're walking to Gethsemane, he talks about him having to go so that the Ruach HaKodesh can come. So again, he's really underscoring, he's putting an exclamation point under the fact that if he doesn't go, then the Ruach HaKodesh, the promise, can't come, which is so crucial in the idea of being able to have that other-centered love, to be able to have that new and quality love that he wants his disciples to have, and to be able to enter into the new contract that his blood is going to ratify the next day. So he's talking about he has to go so the Ruach HaKodesh can come. And another cool thing about that is that in there he's talking about the Ruach HaKodesh being a witness of who he is, but then also his disciples are witnesses of who he is. So, and then sadly enough, unfortunately, he has to prophesy there that the disciples will be killed, and that they will be killed by religious leaders who think that they're doing Elohim a favor. Yes. Yeah, that must have made the disciples' hearts kind of sink a little bit, or maybe they didn't even hear or comprehend what he was saying. Maybe they didn't internalize that, but yeah. And then the 12th thing I see him saying there is he's saying, guess what? Yeah, you're going to have some sorrow here, but don't worry, because you're going to rejoice again, because I'm going away, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to get you. So again, he's underscoring the idea of, don't worry, don't let your hearts be troubled, because I'm coming back to get you. And then the 13th thing is that he talks about everything that Yehovah has is now his. That's huge. I mean, Yehovah Elohim is the king of the universe. And here is this human. Of course, he's divine, but he's human, and he has passed all the tests, and he's passed everything. And so he has everything that Yehovah has, that Yehovah has given him everything. Amazing. So, and then the 14th thing that I see is that Yeshua says to his disciples that the Father, Yehovah Elohim, loves them because they love him and they believe he is who he says he is. So I find that interesting that there is a qualification there on how Yehovah will love us. He loves us if we love his Son and believe that he sent his Son, Yeshua HaMashiach. Whoa, that's pretty wild. I think we want to read into the scriptures what we want to see instead of actually looking at what it says and believing what it says. We say, well, we want him, we want him to love everybody. We want him to, never destroy anyone or something. But that really doesn't go along with what scripture says or what Yeshua says, actually. So right here we see him underscoring and saying, you know what? My Father loves you because you love me and because you believe that he sent me and you believe who I said I am. So if you want Yehovah to love you, then probably getting on the same bandwagon here would be a good idea, in that you need to love Yeshua and believe in Yeshua, believe that Yehovah has sent Yeshua and that he is a prophet Moses spoke of, that we must shema and obey. Yeah. My legs are going to sleep. Oh. Okay, only 3 more. Let's do this. Again, number 15, he prophesies that all of his disciples will scatter from him and they will be offended later on that evening. And then the 16th thing I see there is that he says, I have taught you these things. I am telling you these things so that you can have shalom. Isn't that interesting how he's like kind of painting a picture of they're going to be killed, they're going to be offended by him that night, they're going to scatter and everything. But I'm telling you these things so that you can have shalom. Well, if you look at what else he said, I think you can find the shalom there, in that you can ask to the Ruach HaKodesh. You're going to have that other-centered, new and quality love, that don't let your heart be troubled because he's going to come back. All these other things he's saying, I think he's saying so that we can have shalom, that they could have shalom. Okay, and then finally the 17th thing I see him saying, the final thing that I see him saying, is that he said, yes, you're going to have trouble in this world, but don't worry because I have overcome the world. That's pretty powerful. So if you intake him, then you're going to intake the whole concept of he's already overcome the world, so you're going to intake him. He's overcome the world, so that means that you can overcome the world too. I think that's pretty profound. And that actually concludes his teaching prior to him getting betrayed. And so he concludes it with saying, we will have trouble. His disciples will have trouble, but don't worry, because he has overcome the world. And you could probably sit with that and unpack that quite a bit there. Okay, so then after he finishes teaching, you see them arrive at the garden, and then he actually prays for his disciples, which is amazing to me. He's not spending the whole entire time praying for himself. He's praying for his disciples. Yes, he asks for the cup to pass from him, but he prays for his disciples. And that prayer is super beautiful, very amazing. I'm going to highlight just a couple points in it. So, and again, you find this prayer in John 17, so you can go read it yourself, but I'm just going to highlight a couple points in here. The first thing that he talks about in his prayer is he talks about what eternal life actually is. And according to him, eternal life is knowing YHVH ELOHIM and his Son. And in his prayer, he also establishes the fact that he was prior creation. That he says this actually twice in his prayer, that establishes the fact that he was before the creation of the world, and that he was there in the beginning with YHVH ELOHIM. That he's going to go back to that glory, that he's asking Yehovah to return to him that glory that he had prior to the creation of the world. And then he, in his prayer, he tells Papa that he has proclaimed his name, Yehovah's name, to his disciples. And so he has said the name on the earth. He has proclaimed the name that they need to know in order to be saved. And of course, then he highlights again the fact that he has given his disciples Yehovah's word, but that the world hates them. But he prays that Yehovah doesn't take them out of the world, but that Yehovah keeps them from evil. I think that's pretty profound, that we ourselves can't leave the world. We're in the world, but we don't want to be of the world. And yet we can pray for, like he prayed for his disciples, pray that we're kept from evil. That's actually in his prayer, right? In his prayer to the Father, it's like, keep us from all peril. And then in his prayer, he prays 4 times that his disciples will be in him as and him in them as he and Yehovah are in each other. So pretty profound, pretty prophetic there, that the Feast of Unleavened Bread coming up and all the things that are going to happen in order to make that feast possible through his work is going to actually, make it happen. So he's praying that it all will work forward into allowing him to be in them and them in him and him in them and them, that whole echad circle. And then as he continues on in his prayer, he talks about how truth sanctifies them. So having the truth actually sets you apart. It actually makes you kodesh. It makes you sanctified. And interesting that he mentions in his prayer that he's praying not just for his 12, but for everyone who comes into the fold, basically, through their work, through their words. So he's applying the prayer that he's praying to us, to those that believe now, so in the future. And then he prays that he wants to have his disciples to come where he is going. So he wants his disciples, and remember he's praying for people in the future who also believe and who follow him. He wants us to be where he is going to be in the end after he gets his reward. He wants us to be there as well. What an amazing, just in a few minutes, literally, he's going to be abandoned by all of them, and he knows this, and yet he's praying for them to be with him forever, in paradise restored. Wow, talk about other-centered love. Talk about the ability to lay your life down for another and to really accomplish the goal. He was so focused. He knew what he was there for. He knew why he was there. He knew what this whole thing, that whole 24 hours was going to provide for his friends. And he really wanted to have that happen. And he wanted the other side. He wanted the reward on the other side to not just be his, but the people who loved him. And then finally, as part of his prayer, he talks about how perfection comes through being one with him and his Father, which is so interesting because if you look at the utter relief of holiness being perfection, how do you get that? Well, he's saying right here in John 17 that you become perfect by being in him and him in you and Yehovah in you, and that means you're eating of him. That whole thing is a shadow picture of unleavened breads. So going through the whole process of unleavened bread is actually a practice in what it means to be perfected, to get him inside of you so that you are like him, so that you can have that other-centered love that he's talking about, that new and quality love, so that you can lay your life down for your friends, so you can be so other-centered that no longer are you trying to save yourself, or no longer are you trying to, take care of number one, because that's not love. And if you don't love, then you're breaking the law, the royal law of love. And the whole point here is to get you to be able to keep the royal law of love so that you don't break it and sin. So the more you're like Yeshua, the more you're not going to be breaking that royal law of love and not sinning, and therefore you'll be becoming perfected to be like him. So we can't look at the word love and decide what we think love is or is not, right? It's, there's only one who is good. Yeshua said it's Yehovah. There's only one who is love, and that's Yehovah Elohim, the family. So we have to look at what love is and say, well, how do you want me to love? Well, he wrote down in the royal law how he wants us to love him and how he wants us to love others. So I love that. I think this is a beautiful thing to remember at this time, especially going into unleavened bread. Okay, and so finally, we're almost done here. I just wanted to continue on just a little bit, just telling you what happened the rest of that night. So they get to the olive press, which is basically Gethsemane. Gethsemane was known as the olive press. And there he is arrested. He has his prayer there, but then he is arrested by a band of men. He's betrayed by Judas and then arrested by a band of men. In John 18:3, you see that, and you actually see him arrested by a band band of men, as John 18 records, that there was a band of men in the garden that night. The Greek word for a band of men is spira. This is the word that describes a military cohort, the group of 300 to 600 soldiers. They're extremely well-trained soldiers and equipped with the finest weaponry of the day. We can conclude that when the Roman soldiers and temple police arrived to arrest Yeshua, the hillside where the garden was located was literally covered with Roman soldiers and highly trained militia from the Temple Mount. I want you to really see what a huge crowd of armed men came that night. And this article goes on, and he talks about how, what did Judas actually tell them about Yeshua, and of course they knew Yeshua. They knew he'd been doing incredible miracles and he was incredibly powerful. So perhaps they were scared, perhaps they were nervous. They wanted to make sure and have enough men there to control him and contain him, but interesting that, he could have wiped him out in a second, but he was so focused and he knew what his role was in this whole story and how important it was for him to be the lamb the next day, that he willingly went to the stake. Willingly. It wasn't forced, it was willingly. He took the death position. In Genesis 15, you see him take the death position of that covenant that was made between Yehovah and Abraham. He went through on Abraham's behalf, and he took that death position. He knew he was going to look like those animals in the future. He went willingly. All right, so that concludes my little teaching on the upper room, the Last Supper that Yeshua, our HaMashiach, had with his Talmudim. I am so thankful that you stayed with me throughout the course of this teaching. I am thankful that I'm done now. My legs need a break. I need to get some feeling back into them. So I hope that in the future you consider adding the upper room into your a spring feast season, because there's so much here to learn from our Rabbi Yeshua before he actually became the Passover lamb the next day. So to the King, to the Messiah, and to the Lamb, and to Yehovah, blessed are you, Yehovah, for giving us the Lamb. Blessed are you, Yeshua HaMashiach, for all the work that you did that spring feast season, and blessed are you for sending us the Ruach HaKodesh to do her good work in us, and to finish this job and making us perfected in you. Amen. Shalom. See you later. And then finally the 17th sing. And then finally the 17th sing.